Lifting stones and sandbags and other odd objects sounds cool in theory, and it would be nice to get some of that farmer strength, but does it actually build muscle? This is probably the most common response to sandbag training. While lifting a heavy bag of sand certainly looks difficult, and there's no denying the raw power required to throw 300 pounds up onto the shoulder, it can be difficult to make the connection between lifting a sandbag and getting jacked. Which muscles are actually being worked, and how? A bicep curl makes sense, but sandbag lifting doesn't seem to focus on anything in particular. I had these exact thoughts myself at one point. I think the main problem is there simply isn't much information out there on using sandbags to build muscle. Sure, there are some basic videos on using small sandbags as a replacement tool for basic exercises, but no one needs convincing that a sandbag curl works the biceps. A curl is a curl regardless. But when it comes to heavy sandbag lifting, shoulders and carries being the main exercises, there's not much out there. Compare that to the infinite number of videos and articles on training in the gym, and it makes sense why it can be difficult to see heavy sandbags as a muscle building tool. The first and easiest way to get past this is to forget what you know about the gym for a moment and consider the most basic scenario. If it was someone's job to carry a heavy sandbag up and down the street for an hour every day, doesn't it make sense that there are only two outcomes? Either the person fails and gives up, or they keep pushing and adapt. If they could barely make it 5 steps with a sandbag on day 1, but can go for 2 minutes straight without much trouble after a few weeks, doesn't it make sense that they must have become bigger and stronger in that time? Sure, some of that will be neurological adaptation, but some muscle gain would be inevitable. The mind has a funny habit of getting in the way of basic concepts, but when you step back and look at things plainly, the truth becomes clear. Getting better at any activity where the body is forced to work under tension will lead to muscle gain, sandbag lifting included. Now, straight away, I will say that heavy sandbag training isn't the end-all for building muscle, and there are some things it does better than others, but to answer the question, does sandbag training build muscle, we have a clear yes. With this in mind, we can move on to the how. Well, the basic lift from the ground is pretty straightforward. Just as the barbell deadlift works the entire posterior chain and then some, the sandbag lift from the ground to the lap does the same. For this part of the movement, you might actually say sandbags work better than barbells because you'll be lifting from what amounts to an extreme deficit, which means a longer range of motion. The lift from the lap to chest or shoulder height functions using the same basic principles. Both the knees and hips start with some bend and end fully locked out. This is basic concentric movement, as with any exercise. Now on to the fun part, the carry. In my opinion, this is what really makes sandbags stand out from typical gym movements. Sure, you can carry barbells or dumbbells in the gym, but that bear hug position used to carry a sandbag is unique and can't be replicated elsewhere. This is also the movement that leaves many scratching their head as to how it could actually build muscle. Gym exercise is usually made up of the two main parts, lifting and lowering, concentric and eccentric, and there doesn't seem to be any of that going on with the bear hug carry. To understand this part, we need to consider stabilization. When doing a standing barbell overhead press, for example, it's obvious that the shoulder muscles are being worked. Less obvious are the many smaller stabilizer muscles working to keep you from falling over. Just as with any muscle, these stabilizers will grow bigger and stronger over time. This is why you'll always be able to seated overhead press what you can do standing, but not necessarily standing overhead press what you can do seated. There are more muscles involved in the standing version. Well, going back to the bear hug carry, what you're essentially doing is forcing many of your bigger prime mover muscles to act as stabilizers. Your arms and back and core all fight to hold on to the bag and remain rigid, and if stabilizer muscles can grow by stabilizing, then the prime movers can too. There's also the weighted stretch to consider. Much like how your upper traps grow from a deadlift without any concentric or eccentric movement, the same happens with a bear hug carry. It's actually pretty cool. Once you start carrying a big enough sandbag, you'll be forced to maintain a fully protracted scapula position at all times, which causes a major stretch overload muscle building effect for the upper and mid back. Alright, so we've decided sandbags do in fact build muscle, and we've gone over how they do it. Now let's talk about which muscles grow best. The short answer is the legs, back, arms, and core, but in my experience at least, it can be a bit more nuanced than that. It's possible others may have a slightly different experience than I have, but this is what I've seen from lifting sandbags and stones for a couple years now. This part will have 4 main categories: almost nothing, some growth, gym-like gains, and sandbags are greater than the gym. Starting with the calves, I'm going to put this one in the some growth category. I have seen some nice development from all the bear hug carries, which makes sense as a bear hug carry is essentially weighted walking, and with every step you take, you're doing extension of the ankle, which is one of the primary functions of the muscles of the calf, so it makes sense that they would grow. But my calves still don't look like a bodybuilder's. This is actually perfect for me. I've always skipped calf training because I just found it so boring, and my calves always looked very small. Now they've grown just enough that they don't take away from the rest of my physique. I do still have small calves, but they're not so small that they look funny anymore. So for me, it's been worth it just for that. Moving on to the quads, we have to keep in mind that this is a list about heavy sandbag lifting, and we're only talking about exercises that you can't replicate elsewhere. That's mainly the heavy bear hug carry and the heavy sandbag to shoulder. While you could do a squat with a sandbag, and I do think that's a great exercise, we're not including that here because that's something you could also do with a barbell. If we included the squat, we'd have to include pretty much every exercise ever, which means every muscle group would be in the at least as good as the gym category, and this whole video would be kind of pointless. So with that in mind, I'm going to have to put the quads in the almost nothing category. It was a bit hard to do so. I didn't really want it to be true, but if I'm being honest with myself, I don't think I've actually seen much quad development from either carrying a heavy sandbag or throwing it onto my shoulder. I do get sore, no doubt. When I do my challenge workouts and I'm doing a bear hug carry for a good hour and a half, it does often leave me with growing pain, like pains in my legs, quads included, but I don't think that's really translated to much growth. So for the quads, it's going to be in the almost nothing category. Next up, we have the hamstrings, and I'm going to place this one in the gym-like gains category. This one shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Every time you lift the sandbag off the ground, you're essentially doing a heavy deficit deadlift, which places a crazy stretch on your hamstrings. I've had sore hamstrings from this one many times, and I have seen some nice growth. Moving on to the glutes, this was a tough decision. I almost put this one higher, but this one's going to have to go in the gym-like gains category. I have seen some pretty crazy glute development from heavy sandbag lifting, but I do think you could get similar development just doing the basic exercises in the gym, like a reverse lunge, a hip thrust, or a squat or a deadlift. I think the main reason that your glutes grow so well from heavy sandbag lifting is that lift from the lap to chest or shoulder height. When you're picking the bag up off the ground, obviously, like I said, you're doing a deadlift, so your glutes are engaged when you're doing that. But when you're trying to lift that bag off the lap, you have to be very explosive about it if you want to have any chance of getting the bag up onto your shoulder. And to do that, you're essentially doing what could be considered a standing hip thrust. It's a violent, explosive hip extension, which is one of the main functions of the glutes, so it makes sense that they grow. Constantly having that bag on your lap and trying to throw it up as violently as you can, you're accumulating a lot of volume for the glutes. So for this one, in the gym-like gains, because I have seen a lot of growth. Moving on to the spinal erectors, this is going to be the first one that I put in the sandbags are greater than the gym category. Man, there's something about lifting a sandbag that just lights up your spinal erectors. All the way from your waist up to your neck, everything is completely pumped. And my spinal erectors feel like steel cables these days. They didn't used to feel like that. I used to do a lot of barbell good mornings and deadlifts and all that stuff, and it does work, but not as well, not in the same way. In my opinion, sandbags are far superior. And if I had to choose one muscle group that makes sandbag lifting worth it, this would be it. And it makes sense too. When you go to pick that sandbag up off the ground, you're in a pretty rounded forward position, and this forces your spinal erectors to work extra hard to keep your spine safe. The lift off the ground, I feel like focuses more on that the lower part of the spinal erectors, and then when you're trying to lift the bag from the lap up to your shoulder, something about that just lights up the mid and upper spinal erectors. So complete development, do a couple reps of a heavy sandbag to shoulder and you'll feel it. Moving on to the upper back, again, this one is going straight into the sandbags are greater than the gym category. I spent a lot of time in my life specializing in the upper back and trying to make it grow. I did a lot of rows, deadlifts, all that stuff in the gym, and it did work. I did see some nice growth, but when I started lifting heavy sandbags, it's like the thickness of my upper back just exploded. It felt like it was overnight. Of course, it took a while, took a lot of training, but my upper back is much different now since I started lifting heavy sandbags. And I think it's for a few reasons. Again, when you lift the sandbag off the ground, you get that weighted stretch. But I think the main reason the upper back grows so well is from that bear hug position. Like I mentioned earlier, when you have a big enough sandbag and you have to you basically have to fully protract your shoulders and reach as far forward as you can just to hold on to the sandbag. And that places your upper back into a stretched out position. Now, when you start walking around in that position, every step causes just a little bit of a stretch on that already stretched out upper back. And every step is also just a little bit different. Now you add up enough of those, you go for a long enough walk or you do enough carries, and it makes sense that all of that adds up to a lot of time under tension and weighted stretch for the upper back. And for whatever reason, it makes your upper back grow like crazy. So again, this one's going right into the sandbags are greater than the gym category. Next up, we have the traps, and I'm mainly talking about the upper traps here, but the lower and mid traps are involved as well. I'm gonna have to put this one in the sandbags are greater than the gym category once again. There's something about the sandbag to shoulder that just forces your upper traps to grow like crazy, and lower and mid too. When that bag's on your lap, and you explode that thing upwards, you're getting extension of the thoracic spine, you're kind of shrugging your shoulders, everything is becoming maximally contracted and engaged, and you do that enough times with a heavy enough weight, it makes your traps grow. It's very similar to Olympic lifting. Olympic lifters have pretty crazy traps, and a lot of that comes from heavy cleans and snatches. Well, a sandbag to shoulder is in a lot of ways similar to a Olympic clean, and I think it works in a similar way. So if you want to build big traps, this is definitely going to get you there. Traps go into the sandbags are greater than the gym category. Moving on to the lats, this one was a bit of a tough decision because there are some things you can do with a sandbag that really makes your lats light up like crazy, particularly the sandbag to shoulder carry. So walking around with a sandbag on your shoulder, it makes your lats cramp up like crazy. But I wouldn't say that it makes them grow any more than doing something in a gym would, maybe a little bit less. So I'm going to put this in the some growth category. Mainly because there are a lot of gym exercises that will make your lats grow just so without much work at all. Just doing basic pull-ups will blow up your lats, and you got to work pretty hard with a sandbag to get into that position where your lats are firing. And I have seen some nice growth. They have grown from it, and I do think it's worth doing a sandbag to shoulder and carrying it around like that. It's going to strengthen your lats in a pretty unique way. But if I had to compare it to basic gym stuff, I would say it's probably inferior, so this one goes into the some growth category. Moving on to the abs, I'm gonna have to put this one into the some growth category. This one is kind of similar to how your abs grow from heavy barbell lifting. You rely on that brace. You gotta do the Valsalva maneuver and brace your abs like crazy. And for that reason, you do get some growth, but it's not the same as if you do some kind of flexion-based movement like a crunch or a sit-up. I think that stuff just works better. So while you will see some growth, in my opinion, doing basic gym exercises will work better. Next up, we have the chest, and this one was probably my hardest decision. I do feel my chest working a lot when I'm doing that bear hug carry. You have to squeeze, and your chest is involved when you're doing that. But if I'm being honest with myself and not trying to be too hopeful in my thinking of sandbag lifting, I don't think I've actually seen much muscle size from doing a bear hug carry. So this one's gonna go in the almost nothing category. Your chest will get stronger, and I think it does build a function that you're not used to building. It's something you can't really replicate, so I do think that if you're trying to strengthen your chest, the bear hug carry is worth it to do it for that reason. But if we're talking strictly muscle gain, you're going to be much better off just doing basic gym exercises or calisthenics or something else. So this one goes in the almost nothing category. Moving on to the shoulders, and I realize there are different delts. I probably should have specified specified the side delts here because that's mainly what I'm talking about. The rear delts do get worked a lot, but I kind of included that with the upper back. So if we're talking shoulders or the side delts, I'm going to count this one in the some growth category. There's something about having that sandbag on your shoulder that really forces your side delts to engage. I have seen some growth, but not as much as when I used to do side laterals and all that stuff. So shoulders in the some growth category. Moving on to the biceps, this one might be a bit of a surprise to some people, but I'm gonna put this one in the gym-like gains. Now, when you're lifting a sandbag, you're not doing a curl, you're not, hopefully you're not doing any type of flexion or extension of the bicep, you shouldn't be at least. Basically all you're doing is passively holding on to the sandbag, but you'd be surprised at how much your biceps are engaged during a bear hug carry, and pretty much anything. With heavy odd object lifting, your arms, and your biceps in particular, are often the weak link, which means if you want to build any type of real strength with a sandbag, your biceps have no choice but to grow. It just kind of comes with it. So because the biceps are usually the limiting factor of heavy sandbag lifting, it just forces them to get bigger. And for that reason, I think you can get gym-like gains from it. Moving on to the triceps, we again have to keep in mind that this is a list about heavy sandbag lifting. And if we use Olympic lifting as a guide, Olympic cleans are always heavier than the Olympic snatch. The numbers are just always higher. That's just how it goes. And for that reason, if you're using a sandbag that's heavy enough to be difficult to shoulder, most likely you're not going to press it overhead, which means your triceps aren't really getting any work. If you were doing pressing, sure, your triceps would be working, but honestly, your triceps aren't really doing anything when you're lifting the bag up off the ground or throwing it onto your shoulder. So for that reason, this one's going into the almost nothing category. Finally, the last muscle group on our list for today is going to be the forearms. And while it may come as a bit of a surprise, I'm going to put this one in the sandbags are greater than the gym category. Some of you might disagree with me here, and you could be right. The basic gym exercises have stood the test of time, like wrist curls and extensions, leveraging work, fat bar lifting, wrist rollers. That stuff works, and it works very well. It always has, it always will. But for me at least, when I started lifting heavy sandbags, my forearms just exploded in size, and I think this is for a few main reasons. First and foremost, like the biceps, I think the grip is often something that holds you back. While my back and legs may have been strong enough to lift a pretty heavy sandbag, my grip just wasn't, which meant that every time I was lifting a sandbag, my forearms were working to their max. And if you didn't know, when you're lifting a sandbag off the ground, you kind of have to scoop your hand underneath it, which forces you to be in what is very similar to a false grip in calisthenics, which if you've ever done it, it takes a lot of forearm strength. So doing that repeatedly just caused my forearms to get a lot stronger, and it caused them to grow. So I think that forearm development, it's very underrated with sandbag lifting, and for that reason, I'm gonna put it in the sandbags are greater than the gym. And that's gonna be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this one. Hopefully this cleared a few things up for you. I know it took me a long time before I finally made the connection between sandbags and building muscle, but once you actually try it, you'll see for yourself how well it works. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.